Hello everyone, thank you for coming along this morning. Yes, I'm going to be talking to you this morning regarding ghost ships, including some of the legendary ships of our mythical past. And even one that happened in waters, that was discovered in waters very close to where we're going to be over the next few days, and not very long ago at all. So I hope you find that interesting. But just a little bit of a recap on who I am. If you haven't picked the accent, I'm an Australian. Until very recently, my wonderful wife Leanne and I lived on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, and we left there about 5 weeks ago. We packed up everything. We rented out the house that we'd been living in for 20 years. We left Australia with a suitcase each, and we've purchased this boat over in the UK, and we've renamed it Sunshine Coast. And what we plan to do is cruise around the rivers and the canals and the coastline of Europe over the next several years, however long it takes. And the reason it was called Sunshine Coast, I've been telling people, is because even though we've been researching this for several years, when it started getting pretty serious and contracts were signed and things, Lee got a little bit nervous about the whole thing, and she verbalises that by asking questions and saying that maybe she's not as confident with things as she could be. And she said one day that she loved the idea of cruising around Europe on her own boat, but she also loved living on the Sunshine Coast. So being the brilliant problem solver that I am, I said, no problem, we'll rename the boat Sunshine Coast so you can have the best of both worlds. You can cruise around Europe and you can still live on the Sunshine Coast. And she was perfectly happy with that. She was happy with that until some idiot came out and said, you know, it's very bad luck to change the name of a boat. Now, she's not superstitious at all, but she kept on bringing this up and verbalising this as well, so I knew it was playing on her mind. So bringing my problem-solving skills to the fore again, I said to her one day that, yes, it is very bad luck to rename a boat, unless you do it the right way. And the right way is that you have an official ceremony where you, as the senior lady aboard the vessel, would officially say the words, I renamed this vessel Sunshine Coast, and then you would pour a little bit of champagne on the bow, a little bit of champagne on the anchor, and then you drink the rest of the champagne. And once she heard there was champagne drinking involved, she was fine again, and it's been no problem. And I think she's actually very happy to change the name of the boat every other week if necessary. So I've also been talking a little bit about a deployment aboard the HMAS Vampire through this region back in 1979. And I've been going through some of the stories that happened during that voyage. The first one was about how we came across some victims of a pirate attack. So Vietnamese boat people were attacked by some pirates, and we took about 90 of those survivors aboard the Vampire and took them back to Hong Kong. And then about a week after we left Hong Kong, we were acting as a United Nations duty ship cruising along the coast of Vietnam, and we were buzzed at low altitude at supersonic speed by 2 Chinese jets. And that morning, China had invaded Vietnam. It was the 17th of February, 1979. China invaded Vietnam, and it was the start of the Sino-Vietnamese War, which only lasted for about 4 weeks. So continuing on that story, we went back to Hong Kong, and we were actually supposed to be involved with a war games exercise with an American carrier battle group, but that got cancelled because of the war going on in Vietnam. It was thought that with these two communist powers having a go at each other and fighting each other, we'd stay out of their way and let them continue that and do as much damage as they wanted to do, and that we didn't want to give them anything else to think about during the time. So that the actual war games were cancelled. But the Navy doesn't like people being idle, and if training has been scheduled, training will take place. So various groups went off to do various trainings in different places. And one of my duties aboard the Vampire was I was part of the landing party. We had a boarding party and a landing party. Boarding party was when you boarded another vessel, and that might be to inspect the vessel for drugs or for illicit substances, or in the case of the Vietnamese boat people, to try and help those people. And normally there'd be about 6 to 8 people on boarding party, and they would go onto the vessel with light arms, maybe a sidearm, maybe a couple of submachine guns. But landing party was a different kettle of fish together. You had about 16 people, more heavily armed with automatic and semi-automatic rifles, and your job was to go ashore and search for things or to investigate incidents. And I was part of the ship's landing party, and we had actually never done any training together at all. It was very put together, sort of with band-aids. And so the Navy decided that the landing party for the Vampire would go and do a jungle warfare training course in the Philippine jungle. It was a 10-day course, and when I heard about this, I was rapt. This was boys' own adventure stuff. This was going to be so much fun. And the idea, we got to the camp in the Philippines, which was actually established by the Americans during the Vietnam War, but it had been handed over to and the responsibility of the Filipino Scouts. Now, I don't mean the Boy Scouts, I mean the Filipino Scouts, which is an elite unit within the Filipino Army. It's probably a little bit like American Army Rangers or British Commandos or something like that. And we got to this camp, and there was about between 180 and 200 personnel involved with the training exercise. And the training was supposed to tell us about how to set up ambushes and how to avoid being ambushed, and how to set booby traps and how to avoid booby traps, how to move through the jungle silently and without leaving a trace, and how to live in the jungle and avoid the creepy crawlies that you come across in the jungle. And the culmination was going to be a 30-hour exercise where, in the last few days, where you would your unit would try to get from point A to point B without being ambushed and killed, and then you'd swap places, and you would be the ambushers, and they were trying to get from point B back to point A, and you had to try and wipe them out. And during the camp, the 10-day camp, there was a number of all-in brawls, boys being boys, a lot of testosterone that ran at the time. And while these weren't encouraged, they weren't discouraged either, because it was all about if one of your guys got into trouble, everyone else would come in and help out. And so there was a few of these brawls, and the American Marines that were there didn't like the American Army personnel, and vice versa. The Filipinos didn't like any Americans whatsoever. There were some Indian troops there, and they had some Gurkhas along with them as well. And they didn't really appreciate their former colonial masters, the British. And then there was us, and we were the smallest contingent. We were the only naval personnel, and we basically got on well with everybody. But if there was a brawl, we would normally help out the Brits because they were in the camp next to us, and they were a small group as well. So we decided that we'd help them out whenever we could. That was until the Gurkhas started wearing their big kukai knives around during the evening. And when we saw that starting to happen, we said, okay, well, that's it. You guys are on your own. We've got nothing more to do with this. And what would normally transpire is that we'd have some lectures in the morning, and then we'd go and do some operational stuff and some practical stuff in the afternoon. And I remember I got some of the best advice I ever received in my whole entire life during one of these lectures. An American Army captain got up to speak at one of the lectures. I think it was on the second or the third morning. And I always remember, he had this uniform on. He must have used a whole tin of starch on his shirt alone. It was as stiff as a board. You could cut your finger on the crease coming down the sleeve. It was so sharp, which is in direct contrast to this gentleman down here who I met. He was a former RAF, Royal Air Force pilot, one of those tally-ho chap sort of guys. I met him in the lift last week, and I mentioned to him that I thought he must have ironed his shirt with a waffle iron. But that's Air Force. He immediately ran back to his stateroom and told on me to his wife. Once again, Air Force, what do you do? But this American officer, said that when we're setting up an ambush, they would prefer for us to shoot at the extremities of the body, the arms, but preferably the legs of the enemy, because a wounded enemy was much easier to capture than a non-wounded enemy, and that a wounded enemy was much more likely to give you an intelligence and information because of the fact that they were in shock from the wound, they were distressed because of the wound, and so they would give you more information than a normal POW would. Now, if the enemy actually carried away the wounded personnel, it takes a lot more resources to look after a wounded person than it does a dead person in terms of personnel and also the materials used to look after that wounded person. And it's much easier to follow the trail of a wounded person than it is a wounded person, so you might be able to follow that trail and come across a larger contingent of the enemy. And all that made perfect sense. I'm sitting there thinking, this makes sense, this is fine. Until an American army, the captain left, an American army sergeant got up and he spoke. And he'd done 2 tours of Vietnam, he'd won the Purple Heart for being wounded in battle, and he got up and he said, that was the biggest load of insert expletive here that I've ever heard. To be more accurate with the whole conversation, if you inserted expletive here after every single word that he said, that would be a more accurate description of the conversation. And he went on to say that a wounded enemy can still pull a trigger, and a wounded enemy can still pull the pin on a grenade, and a wounded enemy can still kill you, and much worse than that, they could kill me. And he said that the best place to aim at someone was the widest part of the body, which is the chest. He said there's only one better place to aim than the chest, and that is, anyone? No, not the head, the back. Because if you're shooting at his back, the chances are he's not shooting at you. And that's a good thing. So he said, forget all the John Wayne, don't shoot someone in the back sort of stuff, put them down as best you can. And he went on to say that if you're going to do, and this is the advice that I got out of this, if you're going to do a job, do it properly the first time, shoot to kill. Now, I've always taken that on. I've always used that advice, not going around shooting people, but the advice of if you're going to do a job, do it properly the first time. And just before we left Australia, I did an interview with a news magazine, and part of the interview was they asked you 12 questions about things like your first car and your first job, and if you had a visitor to the coast, where's the best place to take them for lunch and stuff. And they also asked the best advice you've ever received. And I said, shoot to kill. And this reporter looked at me and I said, well, then I had to go and explain the story behind it. So that's the last story I'm going to tell about the deployment of the Vampire in 1979. The rest of the stories I don't think you'd either not find very interesting at all or would be very interesting but not very socially acceptable to tell. And now we're going to talk about ghost ships. The Flying Dutchman, the Mary Celeste, a vessel that, as I said, was found very close to these waters not very long ago, and the famous Lady Lovenbond. But first of all, the Flying Dutchman. This is probably the most famous of all the ghost ships in the world, and one of the great myths of maritime lore. And I remember as a young sailor cruising around aboard the Vampire, and the old salts aboard the ship used to try and scare us with stories about sea monsters and myths, and the Flying Dutchman came up over and over again. And they actually told a story that had been documented in papers and things about an Australian Navy destroyer serving off the coast of Western Australia during World War II, and it disappeared without a trace. All hands were lost. The ship was never sighted again. There was no reports of any enemy activity in the area at the time, so it was a great mystery. And the last thing that had been transmitted by the ship using Morse code were the words Flying Dutchman. And that put the scare right into us, I can tell you. I've done some research into it and there's no such thing occurred, but at the time it was pretty scary. And the Flying Dutchman is about a ghost ship that is reputed to be sailing the oceans of the southern Indian Ocean around Cape Horn. And the myth came about in the mid-1600s when a captain by the name of Henry van den Decken, aboard this man of war, the Flying Dutchman, was coming around the Cape of Good Hope at the bottom of South Africa when there was a storm hit him. Now, he was a very determined man. He was a great sea captain. He'd had orders to round Cape Horn and proceed to another location, and he was going to stick to those orders. But this storm was pretty severe, and he was hailed from another ship that was nearby, and the captain of that ship hailed him using a loudspeaker type instrument and said, "Are you going to put ashore into Cape Town?" And Van Decken, obstinate to the end, yelled back that he would be damned, eternally damned, if he ever did. And such, the ship and the crew and the captain are eternally damned, and they must cruise the waters of the oceans of the world and never be able to put into port. and that the captain himself must stand at the helm for eternity and count off the centuries using his hourglass. So that's the legend of